Our guest today is distinguished professor in PBU's Center for University Studies. She was formerly dean of the School of Education here at PBU and has been a longtime professor, having trained many teachers. She was born in Bristol, Virginia, graduated from PBU, took a master's degree from Wheaton College in Illinois, and received her doctorate in education at Temple University. She's developed numerous programs here at this university and at other colleges as well, trained many teachers who are serving throughout the world, and she herself teaches globally. She teaches throughout the world, and we are delighted to have her here today. So, Dr. MacCullough, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John.
Now, you were born in Virginia.
That's right.
But you ended up studying at PBU. How did that all come about?
My parents moved to Florida when I was 4, so I really grew up in Tampa, Florida.
Okay.
And we still had connections in Virginia. Went to a camp up there that was run by a former professor of PBU. And there were 5 students there that were graduates, not graduates, but they were students of PBU at the time, and they were counseling. And I thought they were the nicest people in all the world. But I was planning to go to Miami University and go into the medical profession. But I came to know the Lord when I was 15, and my brother preceded me to PBU, and then he tried to convince me that I needed at least a year of Bible. So he convinced me by showing me his yearbook and some good-looking guys that were here. And he said, now see, this one, and this one would like to date you. And I said, well, how can I pass that up, you know?
So it wasn't entirely intellectual conviction.
Oh, no, not at all. But actually, the Lord used my brother to get me here. And I entered the 3-year program, which there was at the time. I was in the first class that went all the way through to become a college, and graduated after 4 years. But I was just going to stay at 1 year, then I decided 3 years, and then I ultimately decided to get the degree and stay 4 years because I met my husband to be there.
Wow.
And so you see how the Lord works in strange ways.
Yeah. Well, now, and then at some point along the way, you made a decision, I guess, to not pursue medicine, but to pursue education? Did you know that at the time?
No, actually, I had a scholarship to go into the medical field and missions.
Okay.
And I got that while I was at PBU, actually. And ultimately, when I spent 2 weeks trying to decide whether the Lord wanted me to be single and go to the mission field or to marry Don. And I actually took my engagement ring and sat it on a counter there while I just struggled with this issue. And finally, I just decided that the Lord had given me a good indication that I should marry Don. Wherever he would go, I go then, because I didn't need a special call to be his wife, just from the Lord, yes, but not to a vocation. Even after we were married, to make it a little bit short, even after we were married, I thought that the Lord would have the good sovereign sense to call Don to the mission field. And we did apply to 2 different missions. But we stayed in the pastorate for 7 years, and ultimately the Lord got us out to Wheaton at a little church out there. And Don had gone to Trinity. He was in the theology program there when PBU contacted him and said, we would rather you get the MA degree over at Wheaton. And I was already taking courses at Wheaton. So we finished up there, and we ended up in education.
So then it was at Wheaton, or at least at your time in Wheaton, that you really began to focus in on the field of education?
Yes. Actually, I had, it actually was when I was at PBU. I came to PBU, I won't tell you the date, should I?
No,
a long time ago, okay. And at the time, they said, come. I had $100. They said, come, there are plenty of jobs available in Philadelphia. Well, I got up here, and the job market was closed. And it was a sort of a depressed time. So I went into a newspaper. I found what I thought I could do. It said recreation leader, and I had done a lot with sports, worked in rec, worked in camps in the summer. I went for an interview, and that position was taken. But I'm walking out the door when Mr. Bauer says to me, Marty, come on back here. I want to interview you for another job. And the other job was actually in a pilot program for Head Start. And it was funded by the Smith Memorial Playgrounds. It's the most money I ever had in my life when I took this job. And it was working with 3 to 7-year-olds and trying to find out what would help them, prepare them for school. That's how I started education, but I had no idea of going into it. That was just to get me through school.
Yeah.
So, but at Wheaton, I really fell in love with the whole concept of promoting learning in other people. And that's where I had 2 professors that were just excellent, the LeBars, and then Lawrence Richards. They were all really good educators. They were great teachers. And so I really went in another direction.
You still look back at those particular teachers as being really formative in your understanding of the educational field?
Extremely formative, yes. Yeah.
Now, it sounds, too, like the job you had when you were here, it almost couldn't have been a better fit for what you were going to be doing in the future.
Yeah, but I had no clue of that, but God did.
No, right.
Yeah.
But I mean, looking back.
Yeah. And my first job in teaching was kindergarten because that just fit in with what I had been doing. And then I ultimately taught 6th grade and middle school, which I loved. And then college.
What was it about? Can you articulate why 6th grade and middle school was so appealing?
Well, 6th grade, one, they can catch your puns, and they love riddles and those kind of things, whereas kindergarten is slapstick,
Right.
They laugh a lot.
Right.
They have a lot of fun in learning, but 6th graders can think well. They could also begin to think about life issues at that age, and middle school as well. I love the middle school age because they're right between childhood and teen years, and it's a time when they're blossoming, especially in their minds and academically. And to see students that didn't think that they had a mind really to use, to see them realize that God had given them something to use in their mind. And I saw several of my students go on into gifted programs, and 2 of them into the field of science and pretty high up in the field of science. And that was something I love, science and math. And so that was kind of thrilling to me. Yeah. So.
And I think a lot of people look back on their junior high, middle school years and say those were tough years, just developmentally. Yeah. But it sounds like that. Yeah. You saw it from the perspective of what they were growing into and how they were blossoming.
Now, as a parent, a lot of parents say, can't they go to sleep for those years and wake up when they're maybe 16?
Right.
Yeah, so, no, but I love those. And there's students here at PBU who love that age as well. And there's just, it almost takes, it's not so much a personality, but it takes, look, young children, they love you, and they tell you so. They come up and hug you, I love Miss So-and-so, Middle schoolers, they don't do that. They show it in other ways. At the end of my last year, when 6th grade boys come up and all of them hug you and tell that's special, because that's not what middle schoolers do normally. And so, you have to have a certain understanding of who you are to teach that age and to teach it well, because they don't always affirm you like you get affirmation in the other areas.
And they appreciated your jokes.
Yeah, they were very good. Although they would bring in riddles that I didn't know the answer to. So I'd go over to the teacher's lounge and present them. And I say, you guys have to help me because I need to go back and show that I can do something here with this riddle.
Right.
But,
your reputation was on the line.
That's right. But it was fun. Yeah.
And that was, now were you back in Philadelphia at that point? Or are you still out in the Chicago area? I'm trying to put all this together when you were teaching there in middle school.
I was back in the Philadelphia area. Okay. Don had taken a position at PBU.
He was here, okay.
He was asked to work in the youth department, youth ministries. And so for 5 years, we were here. And then Cheryl Babb was out at Lancaster Bible College, and he invited Don to come out there to be over their Christian Ed department. And Cheryl asked me to come and teach as well, and to begin an education program there. And the first year I was part-time. The first year I was an assistant dean of women, as well as teaching. So the Lord showed me pretty quickly I didn't want to be a dean of women, although, it was
tougher than middle school.
It was tougher than any school. But I did learn a lot through that. But then worked in the education out there. And then when Cheryl Babb came here, he invited Don to come here as dean. So that's sort of how we got back here.
And then when you came back with Dr. Babb, is that when you matriculated at Temple and started that program, or had
No, I
you
was
started
already in it.
You were already in it.
Yeah, if you're in higher ed, you have to get into a doctoral program.
Right.
And it's not easy. My kids were in middle school, high school age when I was doing that. And I didn't want to mess up their lives with what I was doing. But I started at Temple, and I did 1 day a week, and that was Dad's night to take him out for dinner. And Bird in Hand out in Lancaster became his cooking place. And I would come down here on Wednesday. I'd leave about 2:30, come down and take 2 courses back to back, come home late at night. And I did that for about 3 years out there. Then the first summer here, I did my residency. And then my kids were at camp all summer, working by then. And then I finished up when I was here.
So you were at that point a wife, mom, teacher, PhD student, or EDD student. Doctoral student. That's an amazing period of time, I would imagine, looking back. Let me ask you about teaching and education. What does it take in your mind to be a great teacher?
You know what the number one thing is? Not to be a performer, but to be so focused on the learning of those students that are in your care that you're concerned that every single one of them learns. They won't learn equally. They won't learn equally well. They are at different places in their background and content and their own processing abilities. But to be concerned that every one of them gets the big idea of the lesson and as much of the supporting ideas as possible, and they master it in their own language, in their own vocabulary, their own thinking. They can conceptualize and they can use it. And I'm just passionate about seeing other people learn. And it's very exciting to see people learn, whether they're at the upper end or the lower end or in the average in the middle. It does not matter to me.
So the big thing then is sort of self-forgetfulness, that it's not about you, it's about them.
Yeah, learning is about, you have to be a learner. A teacher has to be a constant learner. You have to not just love your subject, but you have to be willing to keep up in your area, your field. You have to be a student. And when I interview students to be for the School of Education when I was dean, I would say, do you like to study? And I had students actually say to me, no. And I said, go join another department, because if you're going to teach, you have to be a student. But on the other hand, once you're have an interchange of ideas in your classroom and you're working with learners, the focus is not on you. And it's not on which students think just like I do, and therefore I'll teach them. I mean, I had professors like that. I had teachers like that. And so they'd teach maybe a third of the class or less and leave behind everybody else. But it's just a passion about having people learn. And it doesn't matter whether it's learning the Bible, which, I'm passionate about having our students here come to know God and know Him personally and know Him through His Word and understand who He is and have a relationship with Him. So, but I'm talking about also mathematics and science and social science and the humanities and the visual and performing arts, that they would just learn and blossom.
Is the natural impulse for teachers to teach in the way that they themselves learn?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so they have to get beyond that.
They have to get
think
beyond
about
that.
the learning styles of
They
all
have-
the students.
I hate group work as a student. I was one, for instance, people would ask me in my dorm, come study with us for an exam. Well, I'd do all my studying first so that I knew I was prepared for the exam, and then I'd say, okay. And it was more an affiliative thing. I'd go, but I became the teacher then because I had already studied and prepared. But that's not the way I learned. I learned through reading, processing, and just I sort of learned alone. And I know that some of my students are like that, even when I have some pair groups. But you know what? They teach then. They help. And another student sometimes can open the mind and be helpful to a fellow student. And so I use methods, for instance, that I do not prefer. And I tell the students that. I say, but you have to realize that there are students who learn best as an interchange of social interaction. And it's just, it's a part of learning how to teach everybody and not just those that learn like you learn. So.
Do you have to then, do you think, know that about yourself to be really effective? You have to know, this is who I am, this is my natural tendency, and I have to move beyond that.
Well, I think so. And I think that most students know who they are. Not all. Not all. There are students at PBU that come in the freshman year who do not know that they can use the mind that God gave them to use. They have been spoon-fed. They have been indoctrinated as much in public school, if not more, than in a Christian school setting, which usually opens up more opportunities, in my view, and broadens and deepens a person's thinking. But they come and they don't know that they can think until you give them something to think about. And all of a sudden they share it and somebody says, that's a great idea. And then, I walk around in freshman classes, I used to walk around and listen. And sometimes even look to see what was being written when I'd ask them to write something. And somebody who hadn't said boo in class, I'd bend down and say, wow, that's a good point. Would you share that with the class? I never would have called on them because they were scared to death as a freshman. But once you affirm them and you see that they're thinking and they do have something to say, you want to draw it out. So those are strategies, and they're strategies that help you, but the focus has to be, do you want everybody to learn? Even the kid who doesn't know he can learn.
So then when someone comes in to interview and you're trying to evaluate, is this individual a good teacher or possibly going to be a good teacher, you're looking for them to care about the students and them to be willing to study. You mentioned earlier they have to understand the big idea they're trying to get across and the supporting ideas. It sounds to me like the teacher has to be organized in their own mind. Are there other aspects that you look for? Any other particular things?
Well, a lot of the students who are coming thinking they want to teach don't understand the concept of the interactive mind, that both inside and outside factors work together in learning. The outside factors are the teacher, the textbook, the new information, the internet, whatever they're researching. And the inside factors are their prior knowledge and their experience. The vocabulary, and for instance, ESL students miss things because of vocabulary, and also their own processing capacity. So when you understand that both inside and outside factors work together, then you begin to look at education entirely differently than if it's all outside factors, or as in progressive education, it's all inside factors. And the teacher just draws out and talks about issues. Doesn't have to be organized, doesn't have to be clear in their mind about what's there, as long as the student is thinking. And I always say, thinking about what? Oh, well, they're learning to learn. And I say, learning what? And so when your students come, they don't have a clue about that concept. What they have a clue about is they love children. That is what they say. And I say to them, what do you think the first and most important role of a teacher is? And a lot of them will say to be a role model. And it is, but not the first. When you're hired to be a teacher, you're hired to teach, to promote learning. And so sometimes they come and they do not have a clue about what teaching is all about. And so it takes, but I look for someone who wants to study, loves their subject. Elementary school teachers, I'll ask them, do you like math? Oh, because some of them say, that's my worst subject. And I said, well, what if you have to teach it? Then we talk. Because some of them are scared to death of mathematics, and yet they're going to have to learn math in order to teach it. So there's so many things involved in it that I don't know who's going to make a good teacher and who's not. So when I talk to them, I get a sense of whether they are going to be a student and not just come and use this as a playground in their freshman year. I usually tell them, you can't play around the first year. You have to have a 3.0 or above to get out of this and get a certification. So you can't get in the hole the first year. You have to study from the get-go. I'm more concerned that they're a student than that they know or have a clue about education.
And some of those things, too, it sounds like you're saying, are difficult to prognosticate when you interview someone.
They are. Some of the students that I'm wondering, and the Lord has slapped me a few times about this, that I think they can never really be a good teacher. They turn out to be some of our very best teachers in the end. And so I think I've learned over the years, I do not judge that on that account. But they have to make it at PBU, they have to study, they have to be a good student. There are certain things that they have to do. And the personality things and some of these other issues, they're just not in my hands.
Mm-hmm. How's the field of education changed?
Oh. Well, it's changed immensely. And I would say that Mary Bud Rowe one time said that the only true thing in science is change. Now, there's some truth to that, but in education, you can pretty much say you stay in education long enough, things change, but they change and go back, change and go back, change and go back. I view education as a pendulum swing that we need to get off of. And we have gone through back to basics movement, and we'll start in the 80s instead of the 20s. I could go back that far by history, not my age. But you have your back to basics, so everything is content and test, and then in comes existentialism and really impacting education at that time, and I choose, therefore I am kind of thing. And so you have, now it's all the student, the active student, and so we go overboard there with personal development, self-esteem movement, and then that's not working. Kids can't make change at the grocery store, so we go back. Now we're at standards and No Child Left Behind, and now we're fighting that again. And this pendulum swing kills education. And I try to help our students understand that they can get off of that by understanding who the human being is by nature and learning, and the nature of knowledge and knowing. Those are the two key worldview issues in the field of education. And once you settle those, some things will never change, what you understand the human being to be. And some things will change as more research and more information comes, but then you have a touchstone by which to judge and evaluate those things that are worthwhile trying and those things that are not. And that particular concept, I think, makes our students more sure when they go out. I will tell you the truth, in all my years here, I continually heard teachers say, your students are so well prepared. Well, basically, what it is, I think, is that they know what they believe. And so therefore, they can be more broad. They can read anything in education. And I have no problem with them reading, studying. They take from it what fits, what doesn't. Things say, hold on, I want to see. They don't just eat it up like the avant-garde innovation of the day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the most important things that gets us off the constant pendulum swing.
There's a center, a core.
There's a center, there's a core. And in my view, there's at a biblical university, the core is definitely biblical answers to life's biggest questions. That's the worldview issues. But in education, the two that are vital are what is the nature of a human being and learning. So you have to put them together. And then what is the nature of knowledge and knowing. And right now that second one is being attacked incredibly with radical constructivism in the field of education. And so our students need to be aware of what is there in constructivism that fits with a worldview. The human does construct meaning and understandings, but not reality and truth. And so radical constructivism goes well beyond what a Christian can adopt, and yet there are things that are very valuable. And I know Christians who throw out everything and anything new because they have no touchstone by which to evaluate and judge it. And I think that becomes a problem in growing as a scholar and as a teacher and as a learner. So I think what we have here at PBU and understanding our own worldview is vital. It's vital in education.
Yeah, it struck me as you were talking that you're not just describing something that anchors you and keeps you from the pendulum, but it also something that enables you to change, enables you to learn.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
Otherwise you can't even absorb any of these new ideas. So let's get down to the basics of some things you said. What's a worldview?
Well, my view, worldviews are defined all over the place. And the term, I think, is used, it's used today in so many different ways that when you're writing, you need to define it. I have used the definition that James Sayers developed in about 1976 because I was looking for a way to take teacher educators and then develop a pedagogy for how to do this in a classroom in a Christian school. And so when you're looking for something that's going to be simple enough that teachers can handle, you're looking for a definition that is a composite of something that will make sense to them and doesn't go on forever. A worldview is much more basic than a philosophy of life, obviously. Walters is my best definition. He says a worldview precedes the science of philosophy. But in a sense, a worldview answers philosophical questions, metaphysical questions, epistemological questions, axiological questions. But the questions themselves are sort of everyday questions that a man on the street might say, well, I'm here. Why am I here? What put me here? Is there a God? What kind of God is he? What am I as a human being? Existence questions. And then knowledge. Well, how do I know? How do I know that I know? You know, those kind of things. And then what is the value? What tells me something is good, better, best, right, wrong, truth, not truth, beautiful, etc. And so I have used the 7 questions, or he actually has 8 now, questions that sort of form a worldview. But a worldview is basically one's beliefs that they have developed over time related to the big questions of life, even if they've never asked them. For instance, John Lennon died in 1980. He was murdered on the streets of New York, and his son was 5 years old. And his son was interviewed by a reporter in Philadelphia, from Philadelphia. I don't know if it was up there. And they had an in memoriam in the Enquirer. And in it, they had Sean saying something like this: now my daddy is everything. Everything is my daddy. My daddy is God. Well, where did he get that?
He's a pantheist,
well, he's
and he doesn't know it.
He's a pantheist and he doesn't know it. But where did he learn it? Mom and Dad, John and Ono, were pantheists. And so he was picking up ideas about God, himself, and the world, and so forth. So a worldview is a set of basic beliefs that answer life's biggest questions, and they're answered differently by different worldviews. A biblical worldview, they're answered by Scripture. Mm-hmm. And I tend to think, because I go to Christian schools all over, and they'll say to me, people will say, well, you can't do biblical integration, is what you can't do biblical integration in a school that has 40 different churches represented. I say, yes, you can, if you use a worldview approach. Because a worldview normally does not, though they're very important doctrinal distinctives of faith traditions, normally a worldview is broader than that. And so to talk about the mode of baptism is not necessarily somewhere along the line in a worldview. Obviously, someone will have that point of view. So it's not the same as the doctrinal distinctives of a church. So I take Christian theism, and I've done that since the 1970s and used that approach. And then I developed a model, a pedagogical model for teaching worldview integration on the basis of the integrating core, not being Bible, because that's what everybody was calling it at that time without a pedagogy. And then teachers didn't know where to start. Mm-hmm. And some were calling it Christocentric. And I don't do that either, although I believe that it is both Bible and Christocentric, because Christian theism is Christ. It's a Trinitarian point of view. But I call it biblical answers to life's biggest questions being the core. And you'd be surprised how many teachers can latch onto that, and they can begin to do worldview integration in their classes. And I have seen them get excited, and the students do. You know what students don't like? You teach a math lesson, a science lesson, a social studies lesson, and they're all excited about it and sitting on the edge of their seat. And then the teacher says, now, that's just like, and he starts to give some kind of an object lesson. And the kids go back, okay, this is the religious part. And they're bored. And they don't connect, because they've taken the mind off of the content of the disciplines. Instead of integrating, They've taken the mind off that, and they've made a devotional out of it.
Right.
And that's not what worldview integration is. And so I have seen over the years people get excited about using this approach, and the students do too. I know they do because I used it. When I developed it, I used it in my classes, and I saw what it did. So
yeah, it strikes me for the students, it's also actually reinforcing the significance and sufficiency of the Scriptures.
Oh,
because
definitely.
there's not this sort of mystical piece that my teacher adds on at the end. It's actually really at the core of all learning and all knowledge.
And John, that's a great insight, because you know what? A lot of teachers think because they're beautiful, nice, and the kids love them, that if they say, now this has worked for me, and they give them some kind of a devotional, that the kids will latch onto it. No. Thus saith the Lord, and God's Spirit has to work in the individual life of the students. Because, you know, we're living in a day and age, a very postmodern age, where kids will say, well, that's truth for you. I still love you. You're my favorite teacher. That's truth for you. This is my truth. Instead of this is God's truth, and I have to be accountable to it. Now I understand it. I understand how it's connected, and let God do the work in their life. And a lot of teachers do not understand that. Bible teachers don't even understand that in Christian schools, because they do everything. I heard a woman say they do everything but really teach Bible. Talk about issues and everything, but they don't connect the issues to Scripture in a way that kids can learn to trust the Scriptures with their life. And the Lord.
Yeah, I would imagine if a student does have that reaction to a teacher, they're really impressed by them, they really kind of think this is a great thing, that's not going to last anyway, because their faith then is founded in a particular teacher, and not in God's Word.
Then they go to college or university where they like a teacher.
Right.
And whatever that person says, it's just, it's a shame, because Christian young people who that's been their sort of the modus operandi of the school that they've been in for one reason or another, sometimes they just get turned off.
Now, are these concepts of having a core, having a kind of worldview and being self-conscious about it, are these things that are just discussed in Christian educational circles, or is this kind of fragmented approach being really questioned and evaluated in the broader educational community?
It's in all areas. I mean, I use sort of a historical approach where I go back to the closing of the American Mind with Alan Bloom, and he wrote that in 1987, and it was a controversial book, but he basically said that we have closed-minded kids coming to colleges and universities because they don't believe anything. They believe everything and anything, therefore they believe nothing. And he's the first who said, you need some kind of beliefs, even if they're just tentative beliefs. You need some kind of beliefs to be able to critically think. You have to be able to judge and evaluate it based upon some standard. And so he was the first. Then a few years later, John Chubb and Terry Moe came along, and they wrote this Politics, Markets, and American Schools. And they examined schools and said private schools are doing a better job of educating than public schools. You know why? They weren't for private schools. They wanted public schools to be the best. But they said because private schools can have a mission, and they don't have to be everything to every person. They can have an integrating core by which they can evaluate and judge and utilize knowledge and grow in their knowledge, which broadens and deepens, those are the terms they use, one's understanding of themselves and the world. And so they were saying that part of private schools' gift to education is that they don't have to be everything to everyone, but they can have a narrow mission. And they weren't talking about a Christian mission.
Right.
And then 5 years later, the Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development, the most prestigious of the organizations for school curriculum, came out and they wrote a book, Toward a Coherent Curriculum. And in it, they talked about this concept of getting away from fragmentation, where then students come and they haven't a clue why they're studying. They don't connect school to learning. It's just, I'm here to get out kind of thing. And they connected that to a coherent curriculum that has an integrating core. That's when all of this started with magnet schools, charter schools, where they more narrowly had some kind of something around which they could organize. Here's a magnet school for science, a magnet school for the fine arts. The kids use that as their integrating core, and then they study all the subjects, but they have a reason for being there. that concept of an integrating core, in my view, was more powerfully addressed in the public arena than it was in the Christian school arena for a good number of years. And now the more and more Christian schools are addressing that. I just got an invitation to go to Albania, and the person who asked me to come, they have a big international school. They're Christian schools. And she says, we don't have a clue about what biblical worldview integration is. I hear that all the time. And I usually get invited to speak when somebody's getting certification, and the Association of Christian Schools International says, you need to beef up your worldview integration. So sometimes I get asked because they want to. Sometimes I get asked because they have to. It doesn't matter to me because it's just an opportunity. And so the fragmentation in education has been devastating. I think that's one of the beauties of Philadelphia Biblical University. And I think that people need to understand we're a university. We look at knowledge and all the knowledges and the disciplines as a unified whole that's held together by the God of the universe. And so that when we use the term biblical, it's an adjective that tells what worldview we espouse. And it's like Catholic University, Hebrew University, and some other universities that put sort of their key worldview in from Christian universities, blah, 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 Christian university. But we've chosen to do biblical, and I explain it that way to those on the outside.
You argue, obviously, very strongly for a core,
Yeah.
but also for a biblical core. You're giving
yeah.
biblical answers to life's greatest questions. Do you think the core in the secular environment can survive if it's just sort of a core that's been chosen, science or you know, something? If it's not a core that really does give biblical answers to life's questions, I'm not sure I know the answer, because on the one hand I would be tempted to say it's great that there's a core, but on the other hand, what do you see as the future of that?
Well, because I happen to believe that a biblical core answers broadly all the questions of life and covers those basic issues that mankind has asked for many, many years. I believe it's comprehensive when most worldviews are not comprehensive. Actually, a science core does start somewhat with the existence of the natural world, but it leaves so much out. And I love, I don't know if you agree, but I love Mortimer Adler. I read him an awful lot. And he wrote a little book, 10 Mistakes That Philosophers Make, that I really like. But one of the mistakes that are being made in terms of worldviews is having a core that doesn't include a metaphysics at all. It may start, as ours typically in the United States starts with epistemology. It's how do you know something? Well, if it works. And it's very pragmatic. So the early pragmatists were all about it working for democracy, working for citizenship, working to make things better. It wasn't a negative thing, but it was all about epistemology, and so it was relative to the time, work for today. Okay, and then what changes? So you take the role model of a teacher, for instance, and we're supposed to be the upstanding citizen. John Dewey said that. But if you studied what the upstanding citizen was in the 1930s, 50s, 80s, and today, it is a moving target. It is all over the planet. You know, it's okay. There was a time when people fought terribly if a teacher was found in a bar and got drunk. They lost their job. And some of these things were written into the contract and some weren't. Now everything has to be in the contract. But now you take what the upstanding citizen looks like. Just look at on the news is what's going on in the educational field with some of our teachers in the land. And it's a moving target. In a biblical worldview, there's no moving target because we're to role model Christ and his characteristics, compassion, love, forgiveness, kindness. I mean, he is there with characteristics that teachers should have. And they don't move. We move toward him by his grace and by his spirit. He helps us to be more like him day by day. but the target isn't moving. So when you take, is it working for society? Is it right for society today? You are really missing out on some of the best teachers in the world, in my view, because the model is, that's just one little illustration. But existentialism and postmodernism have also done their thing. Personal choice is far more important than truth. Any external truth, there is no. And in postmodernism, it's all over the place and irrational. So we've lost the logic of certain things being right and wrong, good or bad, better or best. So these other worldviews that do form a hub and are powerful, really, and I think they are, some of them, like a math or science or a fine arts, some of those things they salvage the lives of some kids, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But they're not comprehensive in terms of life. And school is not just about one's academic life. And then the communities, your social life, and the families, your spiritual life. I don't believe that for a minute. It's not a three-legged stool that we're whole persons. And so school needs to address the whole person. And that's something that I think a biblical worldview does better than anything. And it's true not because it works. It's true because it's God's Word. Mm-hmm. And that makes a difference right there. It's just a different view.
The only comprehensive, satisfying, truly true core.
Well, that's what we believe. Not everybody believes that, obviously, as you well know.
Indeed.
But it's good to know what other people do believe. You can talk to them incredibly better. When I have my students chart the 9 different worldviews that are in Sayre's book, I have them try to identify, even in materials that they read, various worldviews, because that's an opportunity for them to say, this is what I believe, this is what another person believes. Now I know where they're coming from. I can talk with them. Mm-hmm. It opens communication lines incredibly. Even talking with teachers in the lounge about why you believe certain things about kids and learning. So that's what. Yeah, I just love sitting here talking to you.
I wish we could sit here and talk all day. I'm getting the signal that we can't.
Okay.
And so thank you very much for your time,
Well,
Dr.
listen,
MacCullough.
John,
it's been a real delight.
It's been a joy.